For those of you who have seen Henry McArdle's famous painting of the Battle of San Jacinto, you know there's a man at the center hoisting his sword, but you probably don't know who it is. That's Andrew Briscoe. Why is Andrew Briscoe at the dramatic center of this painting? I suspect it may have something to do with his daughter, who was one of the patrons of Henry McArdle, the man who painted those two enormous Alamo and San Jacinto works that hang in the Senate chamber of the Texas State Capitol. We're very fortunate to have with us today Laura McLemore, who has, in addition to her book Inventing Texas that I mentioned earlier, has recently completed a biography of Adele Briscoe Luskin, the daughter of the Republic. And I would like you to welcome, if not Adele Briscoe Luskin, then Laura Lyons McLemore to the podium.
Please don't touch the microphone. Okay. This should be interesting. Well, okay. Yeah, that's okay. I'm glad I'm not talking about the battle. But maybe if I get any details wrong, my predecessors can correct me. I want to talk about some of the social and economic activities that were going on contemporary with the Battle of the Texas Revolution and the San Jacinto campaign. The actions of Andrew Briscoe and the Harrises in the Texas Revolution are not particularly remarkable up against the backdrop of so many remarkable events. But they do give us a clear example of certain facets of American character, and by extension Texas character, that persists to the present day. Think about, they didn't like anyone telling them what to do. They didn't like paying taxes. If you ever let them get away with not paying taxes, you won't be able to start collecting them later. Doesn't this seem consistent with the colonists who got away with not paying English taxes for years after a period of benign neglect until the expense of the French and Indian War prompted Britain to try to collect them? And we all know that didn't work out very well. Or think about the Bush-era tax cuts. They came to mind when I was thinking about this, that were supposed to have been temporary, but when they expired, they became permanent. So I find it interesting to look at the parallels in the escalation of the violence that ensued in both the American and the Texas revolutions. Andrew Briscoe was a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. I think probably if someone recognizes Andrew Briscoe, that's why. He has probably been best remembered as a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. And he was a participant in the Battle of San Jacinto. However, his most significant role in the Texas Revolution was not as a soldier, but as an antagonist and an instigator. He didn't come to Texas out of any sense of patriotism or devotion to liberty and justice. Like many others who came west, he was chasing a dream. The Harrises of New York and Pennsylvania apparently had little or no direct involvement in the fighting the Texas Revolution, but Patriarch John Richardson Harris was among Austin Colony's first settlers and the vanguard of a large family who, like Andrew Briscoe, was motivated by the promise of economic opportunity in Texas. Brought together by ambition and circumstance, Andrew Briscoe and the Harrises provide a glimpse of Anglo-American settlement in Texas and the common traits that seem to characterize Americans to this day. The same financial drive that impelled Moses Austin to Texas to rebuild from the losses he'd suffered in the Panic of 1819 brought John Richardson Harris, a neighbor of the Austins in St. Genevieve, Missouri, to Texas in 1824. He located a league of land, including the Harrisburg town site, which was well situated for navigation and encompassed both prairie and forest. The area attracted the attention of land developers and mercantile interests who became infected with Texas fever by the early 1830s. In 1834 or 1835, Nathaniel Lynch, who lived opposite the junction of Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River, divided and platted his land and named it Lynchburg, while James Morgan, representing a new land company called the New Washington Association, purchased 1,600 acres of land on Cloppers Point across Galveston Bay with the intent of founding a city and developing it commercially and agriculturally. He renamed the point for himself and laid out the town of New Washington. The area also attracted the attention of merchant interest and land speculators in Nacogdoches and Anahuac, including James and Henry Prentice, Henry Raguet, and August C. and John K. Allen. In Port Gibson, Mississippi, Andrew Briscoe, one of 12 children of Parmenas Briscoe, Mississippi pioneer, planter, and state politician, had contracted Texas fever too. At 23, Andrew was anxious to make his way in the world, restless and seeing little opportunity in sharing with 11 siblings. The dark-haired, intense Andrew was easily captivated by all the land excitement on the Mexican frontier. He made a few scouting trips between 1830 and 1833, during which he registered as a citizen of the Mexican province of Coahuila in Texas, garnered a good many contacts, initiated some business deals, and began making preparations to relocate. In late January 1834, he informed the Allen brothers at Fort Jessup, which was about 80 miles east of Nacogdoches, of unavoidable delays in his business that induced him to postpone his immigration to Texas until October, but that he had settled Henry Raguet's account in Nacogdoches. Among other matters delaying his relocation to Texas was some research he intended to do. Having grown up on a plantation with nearly 100 slaves, he saw the slave trade as a real potential moneymaker in Texas, what with Stephen F. Austin and others hoping to attract colonists from the planter class across the South. He wanted to explore the possibilities. He had not yet been to New Orleans, he told the Allens, so he couldn't provide any information with regard to the importation of slaves, but he meant to inform himself completely as soon as he arrived there. He waited anxiously to hear from the Allens about whether they had arranged the $2 per labor land purchase price with Don Vicente Aldrete as they had promised, and to find out how his friend Carbajal was managing his business. Don Aldrete, probably the largest landowner in the Refugio area at the time, was land commissioner for the province of Coahuila in Texas. Carbajal, who in 1831 had accompanied Jose Francisco Madero to survey and issue land titles in East Texas, was a native of Behar but was reared and educated in the United States. Carbajal was elected to the legislature of Coahuila in Texas in 1835 and acted as its secretary. However, he was ordered arrested for attempting to stir up rebellion and left Texas for New Orleans. And much of his participation after that was from the safe distance of that city. If he and Andrew Briscoe were friends, it might be because they shared a restless opportunism. Little more than a year after this letter to the Allen brothers, Andrew Briscoe arrived in Texas with a shipment of goods. He opened a store in Anahuac, which was the chief port of entry east of the Brazos. And according to DeLue Rose Harris, Briscoe had a large store of goods there. Almost immediately, he involved himself in conflict. In another letter addressed to J.K. Allen, dated April 14, 1835, he wrote, "I landed at this place near 4 weeks since, and have since had some damned rough usage, having my goods landed against my will by military force. The people would calmly stand by and see me lose all, goddamn them. I went to Velasco to get justice and failed. The roughest fare and most dangerous excursions unpaid. My business has been delayed, our provisions and groceries seized as contraband, and the whole duties claimed on the balance and the goods withheld till the duties should be paid. And all this by a deputy collector and 40 soldiers. And when I talk of resistance, the people blame me and talk of a jury trial and the devil knows what all. But I calculate that I shall get over it all with little more than the loss of time." At about the same time Briscoe arrived in Anahuac to go into the mercantile business, Captain Antonio Tenorio was arriving with a detachment of Mexican soldiers to assist in reestablishing a customs house there. Mexico had made no effort to collect customs in that department for several years since the Anahuac disturbances that expelled Bradburn and Ugarteca in 1832, and as a result had fostered free trade habits in the interim. Tenorio was not warmly welcomed by the colonists, to say the least. In addition, he reported to his superiors that he could do very little to prevent smuggling because of his lack of boats, because his force was too small to compel respect for the national honor, and that because the post between Bayer and Nacogdoches didn't extend to Anahuac, his position was too isolated. The soldier who was to carry this letter to Brazoria for forwarding returned with it several weeks later, saying that the American with whom he sailed for Velasco landed him on the sandbar, where he was poisoned by the captain of the steamer Ohio, which was stranded there, to prevent him from reporting the smuggling in which the vessel was engaged, a vessel owned, as it so happened, by the Harrises. The inhabitants of Anahuac, displeased with the establishment of a garrison in their midst, determined to resist the exactions of its officers in every particular. So in early May, a public meeting was called, the object of which Andrew Briscoe explained to the gathering, presenting for adoption a resolution stating that because there was no custom house already organized in the colonies of Texas, and no duty on importation collected, because this was the poorest part of the country with insufficient money to pay duties on the importations that had been made, because trade was decreasing daily, it was unreasonable and unjust of Mexico to single out Anahuac for the payment of duties, while the coast and borders remained free and open. Further, he challenged the authority of Tenorio's customs officers, demanded a 5 or 6 year exemption from the restrictions of the tariff, and resolved that no duty should be collected in Anahuac unless the collection was enforced throughout the province. Not everyone in the vicinity agreed on these actions, and before long lines were being drawn between the opposition and the non-resistors. The people of Anahuac, with Briscoe at their head, decided to stand by their resolutions. A few weeks later, in early June, Briscoe followed his rhetoric with action and took a step toward precipitating the brewing revolution of Texas against Mexico. and connected Briscoe with the Harrises. On June 10th, 18-year-old DeWitt Clinton Harris came to Anahuac to purchase goods in Andrew Briscoe's establishment. But once he bought what he needed, the custom collector refused to let him take them without a permit from the custom house. A guard was posted to prevent the removal of the goods. Under these circumstances, according to multiple accounts, another young man came into Briscoe's store asking for a box to put ballast in, and Briscoe gave him one. As the young man started toward the beach with the box, filled with brickbats, Harris remarked to Briscoe that they would now ascertain whether the Mexicans would really prevent him from moving his goods. When an interpreter explained the contents of the box to the Mexican guard, they allowed it to be taken to the beach and put on the boat, but they took Harris and Briscoe into custody. According to Adele Briscoe-Luskin, or her account, another young man who happened to be coming down the hill towards them was shot down by the guards. No explanation given for this. Harris was released the next day and returned home without his goods. Briscoe remained incarcerated. Tenorio's account of this episode, unsurprisingly, differed in some of the details. Tenorio reported that on the 11th of June, the collector asked him for a guard of 4 soldiers and a corporal for the reason Briscoe was going to call during the day to pay some duties which he owed and might attack the office. He wrote Ugartequea that on the next night, Briscoe took a box from his house and went to the shore to embark it, followed by the customs collector and the guard. When they tried to arrest Briscoe and 2 other Americans, they resisted with arms, and one of them, William Smith, was shot and wounded by one of his soldiers. In Tenorio's estimation, Briscoe was maliciously making fun of the collector with all of this because when the box was opened, it was full of junk. DeWitt Clinton Harris, known by his friends and family as Clint, gave another account of events. He wrote to friends in New York that a Mr. Smith was the interpreter who informed the guard of the content of the box. Then he claimed another young man named William Smith came down the hill and was shot. Again, no further explanation. On his return to Harrisburg, Harris sent a report of this trouble to San Felipe that prompted a public meeting on June 21st, in which resolutions were passed authorizing William B. Travis and a company of volunteers to eject Tenorio from the garrison at Anahuac. Travis declared that some of his friends were suffering under the despotic rule of the military. Travis, little sortie, departed with armament consisting of a 6-pound cannon, although some accounts say it was a 10-pound cannon, mounted on a pair of sawmill truck wheels from Harrisburg, where the sloop Ohio, belonging to the Harrises, was chartered. The Mexican troops capitulated without much of a fight. Briscoe was released from jail, the Mexican custom house was done away with, and the Mexicans and the Texans returned to Harrisburg in time to attend a 4th of July barbecue and ball, at which apparently Tenorio was a star, very debonair, apparently. Briscoe followed up with a letter to the editor of the Texas Republican in July 1835, further justifying the action taken by him and his fellow citizens in resisting the collection of duties at Anahuac. In August, he received a congratulatory letter from Travis inviting him to attend a meeting at San Felipe in September on the subject of a convention. "I have seen your publication," Travis wrote. "It does you credit. You have shown yourself the real white man and uncompromising patriot. Stick to the text, and Texas is saved." Briscoe took Travis up on the invitation. In early October, he participated in the skirmish at Gonzales, and later that same month, he captained the Liberty Volunteers, one of 4 companies, at the Battle of Concepcion. and followed Ben Milam in the siege of Bayard. When a convention was called for March 1st, 1836 at Washington on the Brazos, Andrew Briscoe and Lorenzo de Zavala were elected to represent Harrisburg. Briscoe did not arrive until March 11th. Since he had been in the United States, possibly New Orleans, but the location is not identified, before the opening of the convention, and no one knew when he would return, John A. Moore, former alcalde, and who received the third most votes, was seated in his stead. But when Briscoe got there, he nevertheless was seated and affixed his signature to the Declaration of Independence. On March 17th, he received orders from Thomas Rusk to raise sentinels and organize a company of rangers and spies, keep watch out for the enemy, and communicate regularly with the War Department in Harrisburg. The company he organized became known as Company A under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Millard at the Battle of San Jacinto. By fall, Briscoe, again a civilian, was in Harrisburg when DeWitt Clinton Harris's sister Mary Jane arrived to be reunited with her family. In December 1836, Rusk appointed Briscoe Chief Justice of Harrisburg, Harris County. Apparently, somewhat reluctantly, according to Francis R. Lubbock, he took office in January 1837. DeWitt Clinton Harris was appointed county clerk, the first in Harris County. Briscoe married Mary Jane Harris in August, and the couple moved into a house in Houston, which had been designated the county seat. Briscoe discharged the duties as a civil officer, by all accounts, intelligently and efficiently, but always edgily. Regardless of the prestige that might attach to the position of Chief Justice, civil service was never Andrew Briscoe's ambition. He wanted more, and in 1838, a year into his appointment, a new opportunity began to take shape, and he resigned his judgeship to pursue it. Augustus and John Allen and several others of his acquaintance had become involved in a railroad and banking venture. At about the same time, the Republic of Texas chartered 3 other companies interested in the construction and operation of railroads. The railroad ventures were quickly tied to the promotion of municipal real estate. The 4th railroad chartered by the Republic of Texas was the byproduct of a real estate promotion scheme, and it was too close to home for Briscoe to resist it. When the estate of John Richardson Harris was finally settled in June 1838, the beneficiaries of the settlement formed a trust, the Harrisburg Town Company, the stock of which was divided among the Harris heirs, one of whom, of course, was Mary Jane Briscoe. When the stockholders met the first time, they appointed Andrew Briscoe as agent. He resigned his position as Chief Justice early on May 2, 1839. Along with Mary Jane's brother Lou and her grandfather, Louis Birdsall, he became convinced that building a railroad from Harrisburg to the Brazos would greatly increase the value of the company's stock. All expenses incurred by the railroad construction project would be paid from the sale of the Harrisburg town lots. Andrew and Mary Jane Briscoe returned to Harrisburg, and Andrew assumed the role of gentleman farmer. The prairies of the area were well suited to cattle raising, but somehow Briscoe never felt he was successful with it. As the Revolutionary decade drew to a close, the Briscoes, their families, and neighbors in Harrisburg and vicinity seemed to have settled into a peaceful existence that was, after all, quite fragile. Mexico had not given up on Texas, and the United States did not immediately embrace it either. So times were tough. In Harrisburg, by 1840, a town of 1,400 souls, Andrew Briscoe cast about for investment opportunities. The railroad enterprise had not gone well, in large part due to the unsettled political and economic situation in Texas. Although he had begun promoting his Harrisburg and Brazos short line railroad in 1839, by 1840, less than 2 miles of track had been laid, owing to his inability to secure funding. Initial land sales went badly. Subsequent sales held in Houston and in Harrisburg also failed to raise sufficient capital. There was little doubt that the slow sale of property and the impossibility of enlisting foreign investment because of the unsettled condition of the country spelled doom for the railroad project. Meanwhile, Briscoe drafted a complete plan for building a railroad from Harrisburg to San Diego. And in 1841, he received a charter from the Republic of Texas for the Harrisburg Railroad and Trading Company, of which he was president. While he cast about for some way of financing the route, he occupied himself in a number of ways. He obtained a license from the county court to operate a ferry across Bray's Bayou at Harrisburg. In July 1841, he announced his candidacy to represent Harris County in Congress, but changed his mind in August, claiming that the only way he could win would be to buy the election. In 1843, he and Mary Jane's uncle, William Plunkett Harris, entered into a contract designed to raise capital by selling land around Harrisburg to French immigrants. This scheme never came to fruition either. And in 1847, the Harrisburg Town Company transferred all unsold lots and lands to Sidney Sherman for $150,000. By 1848, feeling disappointed and dissatisfied, Briscoe began looking for a new venture. Legal disputes arose between him and Sidney Sherman involving business transactions going back a decade and a fire that destroyed the Briscoe home. The year 1849 was a black year for Texas farmers. A late killing frost followed by severe drought took a harsh toll. These reverses of fortune, as well as a restless spirit, might explain why Briscoe became disillusioned and resolved to move his family to New Orleans. The real answer, though, may have lain beyond Texas. The California Gold Rush, which had begun in 1848, brought 49ers through Houston, where they bought supplies for the gold fields, and the gold bug was contagious. The plan then became to move his family to New Orleans with the idea of going into banking and finance. The proceeds of that business would provide financing for a long-range plan to make his fortune in California. Both his wife and his father had serious misgivings about this plan. New Orleans was an expensive place to live and prone to yellow fever epidemics. General Briscoe expressed fear that his son might suffer from sickness and that he might not succeed in his line of business to his hopes and expectations. These fears proved accurate. Andrew Briscoe died of yellow fever October 2nd, 1849, leaving his wife alone in New Orleans, financially strapped with 4 surviving children to rear. Andrew Briscoe's erstwhile business partner and brother-in-law, DeWitt Clinton Harris, was one of 3 sons of John Richardson Harris. John Harris located in Austin's colony in 1824 and was joined by his brothers William Plunkett Harris and David Harris. At the time, there was no provision in the law for granting land to men without families, but a workaround was found. Such persons joined in groups of 2 or 3, and each group then constituted a legal family. David Harris, John R. Harris, and William Harris received their titles under this provision and located their land, although accounts of the chronology differ. And there was another William Harris who also was a settler in Harrisburg at this time, so it's unclear which William Harris this was. But William Harris, according to the handbook entry on William P. Harris, he arrived in Texas in 1830. John Gates, a colonist, wrote a letter to Stephen F. Austin in November 1829 on behalf of Robert Wilson and Captain William P. Harris, petitioning to become citizens of Austin's colony. There is no doubt of Captain Wilson and Harris's intentions to become citizens of the country, he wrote, and they will be the most enterprising class. In any case, Robert Wilson and William P. Harris were business partners before coming to Texas. They owned and mastered a number of ships on the Mississippi River between 1826 and 1830. In 1826, John Harris laid out the town of Harrisburg, which became a depot for supplies, and his brother David was captain of one of the schooners that ran between New Orleans and that point. Another brother, Samuel, joined the Harrises a short while later. By 1829, John Harris, in addition to founding a town, was the owner of a large stock of merchandise and seagoing ships, and he had erected a steam sawmill. In the summer of 1829, Harris sailed to New Orleans on a schooner he owned with his brother to take delivery on parts he had ordered to complete the sawmill. Unfortunately, John Harris fell victim to the yellow fever that commonly plagued New Orleans in the summer months, and he died there August 21st, 1829. Harris's executors were David Harris and Robert Wilson, his brother and his business partner. Wilson and Harris carried on with the effort to get the sawmill operational. The necessary equipment arrived in March 1830, much acclaimed by the local press. We take pleasure in announcing to the inhabitants of Austin's colony that the entire machinery for the sawmill at Harrisburg has arrived, proclaimed the Texas Gazette. We hope ere long of hearing of its being in active operation, when our citizens will be able to supply themselves with building timber at a low rate, and at the same time, the present proprietors will be amply remunerated for their trouble and expense. The sawmill of Messrs. Wilson and Harris was open for business and working well by the end of July 1830. The administration of the estate did not proceed so smoothly. William P. Harris and Robert Wilson presented large claims against the estate. The Texas Republican of January 3, 1835, announced that William P. Harris and Robert Wilson, trading under the firm of Harris and Wilson, and David Harris and Robert Wilson, as administrators of the estate of John R. Harris, deceased, made a surrender of all their property and that of said estate for the benefit of the creditors in one and the other case under conditions expressed in the act of surrender. The property was to be divided into parcels or lots wherein its nature or locality will admit the proper division. Speculators and others who may be desirous of becoming possessed of valuable lands and other real property will find it their interest to attend the sale, as it will be remembered that there is a very valuable steam saw and grist mill to be sold, and several valuable and well-timbered tracts of land lying contiguous on a navigable stream. First notice of this sale was published October 24, 1834, and the public sale was to take place January 1st in Harrisburg. The heirs sued the administrator, David Harris, and the firm of Harris and Wilson, which kept the estate tied up in court until 1838, when it was finally settled by compromise. Harris's granddaughter, Adele Briscoe Luskin, contended that this litigation, more than anything else, prevented Harrisburg from becoming the county seat in 1836. Coincidentally, the sawmill, originally built by John Harris, was burned by the Mexicans in 1835. In addition to operating the sawmill, Wilson and Harris owned two ships, the Nelson and the Macana, which were used in 1832 to eject the Mexican garrison during the Anahuac disturbances. Meanwhile, John Harris's widow, Jane Birdsall Harris, and her teenage son, Clint, had come from New York in 1833, one would assume, to look after her own interests in her deceased husband's estate. And they opened a store. Harrisburg seemed to be prospering. A school was started in 1834 and did well by available accounts until Clint and Andrew Briscoe were arrested at Anahuac in June 1835. That event threw the neighborhood surrounding Harrisburg into such a state of excitement that it became impossible to continue the school. As Adele Briscoe-Luskin pointed out in her History of Harris County, 1822 to 1845, the role of the Harrisburg settlers in winning Texas independence from Mexico has garnered little fanfare, yet each participated in various ways. At the convention of 1832, William Harris was appointed a member of the Subcommittee of Safety and Correspondence for the District of San Jacinto, and when that committee was reestablished in 1835, he resumed his membership. He represented Harrisburg in the consultation in the fall of 1835 and as chairman of the Committee on Naval Affairs. He was active in its deliberations. He also served in the General Council until December 30th, 1835, when he left to assume duties as collector of the Port of Galveston. During the spring campaign of 1836, he transported government supplies and personnel aboard his steamboat, the Cayuga. David Harris also continued his shipping business during the restless period between 1832 and the end of the Texas Revolution in 1836. He sold the Nelson in 1833, but commanded the sloop Ohio in the attack on the Mexican garrison at Anahuac in 1835. Jane Harris housed the provisional government when it retreated from Washington on the Brazos to Harrisburg following the convention, then had to retreat herself, first to Anahuac and then to Galveston in the face of the advance of the Mexican army. When war with Mexico came, Harrisburg organized two companies of volunteers, one at Lynchburg and one at Harrisburg. The account of Lewis Birdsall Harris, youngest son of John R. and Jane Harris, provides much detail surrounding the Battle of San Jacinto, though he arrived just after it ended. Lewis had grown up in New York and at the age of about 18 went into a merchant business with a cousin in Pinon. He decided, however, that due to the bad habits of his partner, Sam Kindig, they would not succeed. So he sold out his interest and went to Texas. He arrived in New Orleans on March 31, 1836, to learn that the Alamo had fallen and the Texans were in retreat before Santa Anna's army. The reports made it difficult for him and a few of his fellow travelers to find a vessel and crew to take them to Galveston. But by April 13th, he reported that he had rounded up about 25 men who agreed to go. They were, he said, 20 odd as determined men as he had ever seen before or since. Early in the morning of April 21st, Harris recorded that he awoke to a racket on deck occasioned by the appearance of unidentified ships on the horizon. As it turned out, the vessels were friendly. They escorted Harris and the company to safety at Galveston, where he was greeted by Lorenzo de Zavala and reunited with his mother and brother, Clint. Lewis and his traveling companions were enrolled for duty and took turns standing guard and patrolling the island. On April 26th, word came that Santa Anna had been defeated at San Jacinto. After escorting his mother back to Harrisburg, Lew went to Houston's encampment and witnessed Santa Anna, General Cos, and General Almonte in detention. By May 8th, the last of the army left, and Lewis and Clint set about securing accommodations for themselves and their mother. They concluded to build a house on the site of the original one the Mexicans had burned. By his account, it was an ambitious project. Built in the size and shape of their grandfather's house in Seneca, New York, it was 56 feet long by 36 feet wide, divided into 4 rooms, 22 by 18, with a center hall 12 feet wide. And it had a second story. By December 1837, the Telegraph and Texas Register carried a notice that the large and commodious house at Harrisburg, now occupied by Mrs. Jane Harris, was for sale. Said house is well situated and calculated for a tavern, has 4 large rooms and hall below, and a room about 56 by 36 feet, also a good kitchen attached. Will be sold or rented on reasonable terms and time given. Apply to DWC Harris in Houston or LB Harris on the premises, Harrisburg, December 22nd, 1837. One could assume that the sale of the house so soon after its completion was related to the troubles with the Harris estate, but we don't know. William Plunkett Harris served the Republic as Land Commissioner of Harrisburg County in 1838 and as Alderman of the town of Harrisburg in 1842. During this period, he was the director of the Harrisburg Town Company, one of the proprietors of the town of Coshada on the Trinity River, and a planter with a large estate at Red Bluff on Galveston Bay. In 1840, Harris married James Morgan's daughter, Caroline E. Morgan, and they had 1 son and 1 daughter. Harris died on December 8, 1843, and was buried in the Harris-Beasley Cemetery at Red Bluff. In December 1838, the Telegraph and Texas Register listed for sale a league of land on the San Jacinto River, formerly one of Austin's reserve leagues, known on the county plot of Harrisburg as the property of David Harris. David Harris died at the home of a son on Middle Bayou sometime after November 1841. By 1838, Lewis Harris was a member of the Milam Guards and county assessor. He served as a private in the expulsion of Rafael Vasquez on the Somerville expedition. But like his brother-in-law and so many others, Lewis was bitten by the gold bug and on April 14, 1849, set out for California, where he lived until his death in 1893. Clint was county clerk of Harrisburg County from February 6, 1837 until February 9, 1841. He was a director of the Harrisburg Town Company from 1839 to 1847, and after Andrew Briscoe's death, agent for the company. In 1842, he was elected alderman of Harrisburg, became involved with the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railway Company from 1850 to 1861 as contractor, conductor, director, and secretary, and jack of all trades. And for a number of years, he was postmaster of Harrisburg. He died in Harrisburg in January 1861. Jane Harris outlived her oldest son by 8 years. She remained in Harrisburg until she died in August 1869, operating an inn patronized by travelers on the Buffalo, Brazos, and Colorado Railway. The saga of the Briscoes, the Harrises, and their neighbors who settled in Austin's colony and participated in liberating Texas from Mexico provides a clear example of what John Bainbridge, the Super-Americans, and Randolph Campbell, gone to Texas, describe as Texans' outsized emphasis on qualities and characteristics that are distinctly American. The similarities between the American Revolution and the Texas Revolution are remarkable. Intensely individualistic people, driven by a desire to make money. There's a period of benign neglect, followed by an effort to collect rightfully owed taxes, reorganization of a ruling government, and hypersensitivity and antagonistic reaction to these changes, the development of a justifying narrative, and intentional provocation. Think the Boston Tea Party and the Sons of Liberty, Goliad, Gonzalez, Velasco, Anahuac. Ironically, this first generation never realized the great wealth they pursued, though their grandchildren did. Andrew Briscoe and the Harris brothers found, like some Americans do today, that success is more complicated than they thought it would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We're honored to have as our final speaker this morning J.P. Bryan. someone who himself, like Steve Harden, needs no introduction, but we'll get one anyway. For those of you who have not been to Mr. Bryan's latest achievement, if I may call it that, I urge you to go to the Bryan Museum in Galveston. The Galveston Orphans Home was itself an orphan. When Mr. Bryan and his wife Mary John transferred their remarkable collection, which had been accumulating over many years, to this museum, which JP, I misread the blurb I got from your museum. It said you had been collecting this stuff for 12,000 years. I knew you weren't quite that old, but the collection spans 12,000 years, from the early Native American inhabitants of Texas through the Spanish period and on well past the Civil War. It is an experience to go through this museum. JP, as all of you should know, is a direct descendant of Moses Austin and Emily Austin, the sister of Stephen. He represents a link to the Texas past, which is rather unique. And his interest in the Texas past has informed his life from the time he was a boy. As a businessman, as a patron of the arts, as a mentor to historians, and supporter of the Texas State Historical Association, which will, as you've heard, take over this symposium beginning next year. J.P. Bryan brings to us a unique perspective on the legacy of this battle on whose site we sit today. And so without further ado, let me introduce J.P. Bryan.
Well, it's indeed a pleasure to be here. I am sorry to find out that I am delaying your lunch, though, so I hope you're not getting too hungry. It is difficult to speak to hungry people. I know that. So I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. Now let me see here. I've got something that's supposed to just do it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, good. I'll leave this one up here. This is our diorama of the Battle of San Jacinto. So I was asked to speak to all of you today about the Battle of San Jacinto itself, and I'm sure there are many people in this audience today that are very expert on that quite seminal event in Texas history. But I wanted to touch on a few things which I think establish the importance of the Battle of San Jacinto from a world perspective. And then also drill down and look at a few of the little events of the battle itself, which I think offer it some unique sort of personal distinctions. And then just end with, why was this so important? Well, first of all, let's say about this event, this was not some regional expression of an effort by a bunch of Anglos to extend slavery and grab land that they didn't rightfully own. First of all, it was part of a worldwide movement that was occurring throughout the world for those countries that were seeking more democratic rulership or were simply trying to remove the colonial pressure that had been put on them and return rulership to their own country. Now, there were some very clear and good examples of this occurring in the world at that time, such as the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, which had occurred with many Mexican participants in it. However, in the new Texas Revolution that was about to ensue, those guys were on the wrong side of the event, at least from most of us in this room's perspective. But, so that was one of the first things that we noticed about the revolution itself. It was part of not just some regional endeavor, but a worldwide movement that was taking place. Also, if we look at it, I can't hear you. You can't? Oh my gosh, okay. Sorry about that. Can you all hear me? Good. Okay, the other thing that occurred was Santa Anna chose to rescind the Constitution of 1824. Many of you in this room may know that that Constitution was drafted in large measure by Stephen F. Austin himself. And this was not an isolated situation where just the state of Texas was offended by Santa Anna's conduct in repealing the Constitution, establishing himself as a dictator, and dismissing the political establishment of Mexico. There were 12 states that responded similarly throughout the Republic of Mexico, Zacatecas being the closest one to Santa Anna, who they raised an army of about 2,000 people in opposition to his conduct. Santa Anna retaliated against them with some 400 men and completely devastated that army in short order, and then allowed his soldiers to ravage the city for 3 days. Now, if you go to Zacatecas today, there you will find that there is not a more hated person in all of Mexico than today Santa Anna in Zacatecas. Now, so Texans also uprose in protest against his conduct, and there was strong sentiment that if they could get an army to invade Monterrey, that there were plenty of people in Monterrey that were willing to join in Texas in rebellion. The conditions being, of course, that we weren't going to try to establish a separate nation or republic, but that we would just rejoin ourselves to Mexico under the Constitution of 1824. Well, so in Santa Anna's response to what had happened in Texas, he assembled an army after putting down the war with the Zacatecans. And the army he cobbled together was 6,028 strong. So that's a very large army, especially when you think it was going to be complemented with some 4,000 camp followers. So his army of about 10,000 individuals was about to invade Texas. So why, we all would ask, was Santa Anna making such an emphatic statement in the size of the army he assembled? Well, this was an answer to the United States, not to those in revolt in the state of Texas. He was telling the United States, don't tread on Mexico. Don't dare cross the Sabine River with any ambitions of trying to assist the Texans or take what land we believe is rightfully ours. And so clearly when he invaded Texas with his army of 6,028, he had an idea of a potential contest with the Texas Army. Now, one thing that we ought to clearly understand, there were plenty of people until Santa Anna repealed the Constitution of 1824 that wanted to maintain its status as a state in the Republic of Mexico. And it wasn't until that event occurred that Stephen F. Austin sided with the war dogs, Travis and Fannin and the likes, and said, okay, it's time for war. Now, what was also incentivizing Santa Anna? He knew that Andrew Jackson had serious aggressive ambitions for the land that we know as Texas, or did know as Texas in those days. Actually, his ambitions stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He'd actually made an overture to try to acquire that land, to buy it from Mexico, what they took as a considerable insult. But Andrew Jackson had made it known to Pendleton Gaines, the commander of the United States Army stationed at Fort Jessup, that he was to offer his services to the citizens of Texas if required, and Santa Anna was certainly very aware of that. So there were 8,000 men in the United States Army stationed at Fort Jessup at this time. Now, sandwiched between those 8,000 men at Fort Jessup and Santa Anna's 6,027 or 28 men was the Army of the Republic of Texas, which, depending on what day of the week it was either 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000. But if you reflect on this for a minute, this was a combined fighting force of 18,000 combatants. Now, to put it in proper perspective, that is larger than any fighting force ever on American soil except for those that fought in the American Revolution, of which there were about, at one time, about 80,000 soldiers in the combined effort. In the War of 1812, which was the next largest encounter, there were about 11,000 soldiers involved in that combat. So what you had potentially, possibly occurring in Texas was a war between 18,000 individuals, which would have made it one of the largest wars conducted in United States territory. But also, think of the international repercussions. If Gaines did cross the Sabine River, he was going to be violating the laws against trafficking or trading with or trying to take a foreign country, the laws of immunity. And so this was going to be a serious international problem. So this whole battle, or a whole potential battle, takes on an entirely different scope or importance when we see it as the international repercussions would have occurred had the United States chosen to go ahead and cross the Sabine River. So that is a very distinguishing feature of that entire engagement. But also there's something else, a third thing that's very unusual about the Battle of San Jacinto. And that's the people whose lives were defined by that event. And they were some truly remarkable leaders. They were, of course, General Sam Houston, the Mexican General San Antonio Lopez de Santillana, and the self-styled Napoleon of the West, and Stephen F. Austin, who with in their respective cultures and the era in which they were defined, all these possess the elements of which heroes and legends are made. Clearly we can say that about Austin, he was a man of great diplomatic skills. Certainly he, as much as anybody, laid the groundwork upon which to plant the Lone Star flag by having brought some 10,000 families to Texas. Houston, in his efforts, clearly can be identified as a capable politician, if not one of the best. And what happened with the Battle of San Jacinto, it certainly defined the final careers of all of these men. For Houston, the battle propelled him back into politics, and a position he was assumed for some 26 years. He was twice elected president of the Republic of Texas, a separate nation. He was also, once Texas was annexed, he was a congressman, United States senator, and elected governor. He's the only man in United States history who was governor of two states, Kentucky, Tennessee and Texas. Santillana, for his part, unfortunately, the loser of the Battle of San Jacinto, though his career continued, he was 11 times elected president of Mexico and served as the commander of the Mexican Army in the Mexican-American War, but his career was definitely on a downward trajectory for the rest of his life. For San Jacinto, for Austin, this was a time a man for whom the bell tolls. 45 days after the Battle of San Jacinto, he died. His body consumed by 15 years of laboring for Texas and dependent upon and despondent over the humiliating defeat in his run for the presidency against Sam Houston. He said in his closing moments of his life, "The prosperity of Texas has been the object of my labors, the idol of my existence. It sustained the character, it assumed the character of a religion for the guidance of my thoughts and actions for 15 years. It would be hard to find a person of such ability who fell more deeply in love with a piece of land we all call Texas." Now, one of the most debated things about Sam Houston, for all of you who have followed his career, know, is his conduct throughout the San Jacinto campaign. And I think this is worth further discussion, because most people line up either as strong advocates for Houston's retreat, or as they like to call it, retrograde across the surface of Texas. Those are who his defenders, or those who are his outspoken critics who call him equivocating, not realizing the opportunity to take value of war when circumstances seem to present themselves in a very favorable light. But I would tell you that I started off and I wrote a speech in 1981 on this entire subject, and I was not a supporter of Sam Houston. I felt like he equivocated, he evidenced what seemed to be maybe even some cowardice, but certainly didn't communicate with his fellow officers. I could not understand his entire battle plan. But I have changed greatly my opinion of Sam Houston and his conduct. And let me tell you why. First of all, let's just discuss a bit the whole effort his whole effort throughout the San Jacinto campaign. Now, as many of you know who are followers of Sam Houston, he had a few problems, a few frailties, even though he was a great leader of men and a fond follower of women. But he had a bit of a drinking problem. As a matter of fact, the Cherokee Indians called him Big Drunk. And he never evidenced this any more obviously than in the period of time when he was about to assume command of the Texas Army. However, he did acknowledge to everybody present that he was going to quit the spirits throughout the entirety of the campaign or the war itself. Now, when he said that, he might not have known he was going to have to go 6 weeks or so without a drink. But we have to ask ourselves, so what was the effect of this on his temperament? Would he have had withdrawal symptoms and serious moments of despondency? And would he therefore retreat from communication or relationships with other people with whom he otherwise would have confided? Or did he need alcohol actually to encourage that sort of engagement with others? Well, there were those who acknowledged that he quit drinking, but also charged him with having taken opium throughout the retreat across Texas. Now, frankly, that seems highly unlikely, but there were numerous people at that period in time who dipped opium, much like people dip snuff today. As a matter of fact, Santa Anna was accused of having done or asked for opium when he was considering his conversations with Sam Houston after he was captured. But anyway, there is a better reason for why Houston never chose to engage Santa Anna throughout his so-called equivocating retreat, and that is that it was, without question, the best plan until something else became available. We can discuss what some of those benefits were. Obviously, the further Houston could draw Santa Anna into Texas, the better the chances for a decisive victory. Santa Anna's supply lines would be extended, and he would be heavily dependent on local foraging to satisfy the physical demands of his army. Also, the Mexicans knew very little about East Texas. The only one in their entire entourage that had any experience there was Almonte. So the further they got into Texas, the better off it was logistically for the Texas Army. Also, if you were in the Mexican Army, think about this a minute. They had been walking now from their homes in Mexico 2,500 miles. They knew little or nothing about the battle or the cause for which they were fighting, and if they did, they probably wouldn't necessarily have supported it. Furthermore, if we think for the Texans who were retreating that the retreat was repugnant because they were anxious for a fight, think about the poor Mexicans that were in pursuit across this hostile territory. It must have been a most unpleasant experience for them. So there are those issues that we know were motivating Houston. In addition, he was nearing himself to his old Cherokee chief, Bo, Bull had adopted him into the Cherokee Nation, so there could well have been a modicum of hope that somehow Bull would give him safe coverage or passage there in the Cherokee Nation. And because he and Houston and Forbes had secured for the Cherokees the right to the land just before the Declaration of Independence had been signed. Well, what we do know is the thing that more than likely, however, was a real motivation for Houston is that he was aware of Pendleton Gaines' presence at Fort Jessup with 5,000 crack troops from the United States Army who were fresh from the Seminole Indian Wars. They had specific orders from Andrew Jackson to invade Texas if they were needed, to put down any uprising they deemed a threat to the civilian population of Texas, with no real definition from Jackson as to what that uprising might be. Houston knew that he could encourage the participation of those soldiers in any eventual confrontation he might have with Santa Anna. How do we know that? Well, I'll tell you the answer to that shortly. Now, certainly on his part, Texas Secretary of State Samuel Carson was certainly doing his best to add emphasis to the help available from Gaines and the fact that Andrew Jackson maintained that the Neches River, not the Sabine, was a legitimate boundary between Texas and the United States. In 3 correspondence directed to Houston and Burnett, Carson said, among other things, you must fall back to the Sabine if you can, unless you have no doubt that you can whip them. In spite of neutrality wars, Texas received support in the form of money, arms, munitions from Texas citizens, and now it seemed troops from the United States Army stationed at Fort Jessup were moving to reinforce General Houston and his Texas forces. In April 1836, a lieutenant stationed at Fort Jessup, N.C. McRae, predicted General Gaines' involvement in an impending conflict. On April 12th, McRae wrote to his superiors in Washington, D.C., saying Gaines will, in all probability, take the field in the next few weeks. Another U.S. officer verified that federal troops were being moved from Fort Jessup toward the Sabine River and the Texas Army. Captain Brevet Major B. Kelly reported from Fort Jessup that troop numbers were reduced by 5 companies of the 3rd Infantry on April 13th and that had left for the Sabine River. Riley further noted that several companies of the 3rd and 6th Infantry had marched to the Sabine during the same month. On the very day that Fort Jessup troops moved towards the Sabine River, Secretary Carson arrived at Nacogdoches and met with General Gaines. Carson reported the general's position as a very delicate one, which required the most cautious movements. Early the following morning, Gaines ordered 13 companies to march to the Sabine with field pieces and 12 days' rations. He requisitioned Louisiana Governor E.D. White for a brigade of 1,000 volunteers and also asked the governors of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama for troops. Within the next few days, Gaines expected to have between 7,000 and 8,000 troops under his command. The day after the arrival at Fort Jessup, Carson stated the belief that as soon as Gaines was ensured that the Mexicans had Caddo, Cherokees, and Indians of other tribes with him, he would act with energy and efficiency. The Secretary of State said he had no doubt that Carson's proof would be abundant by the time he reaches the Sabine, in which case he will cross and move upon the aggressors. He reminded President Burnett, his situation is very sensitive and I can't tell you any further details. On April 15th, the Assistant Quartermaster at Fort Jessup responded for funds with a request for funds from U.S. Army Quartermaster Major Thomas Jessup for whom Fort Jessup was named. Alexander explained that the preparation for sizable troop movements, Gaines had requested him to purchase a large number of mules and horses. Alexander was also charged with providing transportation for the necessary supplies, which he noted were extraordinarily expensive due to the very bad state of the roads and the scarcity or total absence of forage in the country itself. During the month of April, and this is a key to the whole strategy of Houston, I've come to find. We have now established that there were couriers throughout the month, possibly in March, and certainly throughout the month, the entire month of April, that were carrying frequent messages between Gaines and Houston. In fact, one document from Gaines states that Gaines' position is now only 3 miles from the Sabine River, and he is moving to cross. Following the Texas victory at San Jacinto, the first communication that Sam Houston sent after that victory was not to the President of the Republic of Texas, David Burnett. It was to Gaines on the Sabine River, warning him not to cross because they had secured a victory over the Mexican army. So to me, those facts truly confirm the thinking of Houston at this time about he wanted to get under the halo of Gaines on the Sabine River, or as close as he could get, and encourage his support. It was made clear in a speech that Sam Houston made in 1845 when he recounted the events of the fateful day of April 21st, and recalled that when Deaf Smith returned from a scouting expedition, reported that the army was advancing, he, Sam Houston, determined to retreat and get as close to Andrew Jackson and the old flag as he possibly could. So Houston's column passed New Kentucky. When it passed New Kentucky, to determine whether to go to the flee to the Redlands or engage the enemy, Houston opened a letter from Carson assuring him that if Houston was forced to retreat to the Sabine, he would be there with plenty of volunteers to help him secure a victory over the Mexican army. There is nothing to indicate that Houston, until March 28th, followed a plan to do anything but avoid a fight unless victory was assured. Helped by the addition of 5,000 or more U.S. troops, victory would certainly be a certainty. He arrived at San Felipe de Austin on the Brazos on March 28th. Here, open resistance to his command was ignited in the persons of Mosley Baker and Wiley Martin, who refused to participate in this endless retreat. Realizing he was not going to win a war against his own men, Houston wisely turned them over to their own desires. He ordered Baker with 120 men to San Felipe to defend the ford there, and then he where he was nearly certain to get into a fight with members of the opposing Mexican army. He also sent Wiley Martin, according to some reports, with 100 men to hold the crossing at Fort Bend near the present-day town of Richmond. Martin said he never had more than 50 men. This was about the only order from Houston that these two men were going to obey. Houston then moved further up the river to Gross's plantation and then began training. On the 4th of April, Rusk arrived. On the 11th of April, the twin sisters arrived. On the 14th, Sam Houston chose to cross the Brazos River. On the 18th, 16th, he turned right at New Kentucky, or the fork in the road, and on the 18th, Deaf Smith delivered to him the Rosetta Stone of the Texas Revolution. He had intercepted communication from Philisola on the Brazos River telling him that Santa Anna, with only 500 men, had gone to Morgan's Point. So at that moment in time, the Texas Army decided it was time to go to war, and to war they went. On the 21st, they enjoyed an incomparable victory and a battle that lasted less than 18 minutes. So, when we look at that battle, what are some of the more interesting personal things we can draw from it? Well, one thing that I've come to find in my research is that there was almost no fact about the Battle of San Jacinto that was reported by early historians, other than the outcome. We did win the battle, by the way. That was correct. I found it nearly amazing. And one of the more egregious misstatements about the battle began with the commander himself, Sam Houston, in his report to Burnett on the 25th. He stated that he had 783 men. Well, better research has revealed over time that the Texas Army probably was at least 930 strong. Now, they had left about 250 with the baggage at Harrisburg. The Mexican army that opposed it was not twice its size. As a matter of fact, it could have been smaller because Santa Anna clearly left the Brazos with only 500 men. Coast sent a 500 support, but only 400 arrived because they left some at Sims Crossing and at Vince's Bridge. But what is clearly missing on the San Jacinto Monument is recognition for any blacks who participated in the Battle of San Jacinto. And there are at least 3 that we can identify as having been in the Army and who were definitely on the battlefield of San Jacinto. They were Hedrick Arnold, who was Deaf Smith's brother-in-law. There was, and he was a member of Carnes's spy company, and Macklin Mac Smith, who was the slave of Major Benjamin Fort Smith, and served with Captain William Patton's company, and a black man who legend has neither supplied with a Christian name nor proof of existence, simply referring to him as Dick the Drummer. Another black indentured servant by the name of James Robinson missed the battle as he was ordered to remain with the baggage at Harrisburg. Now, there is good evidence to establish these men's participation in the records of the 3rd Congress of Texas, the land records of Harris County, and others that fought in the battle itself. As a matter of fact, a petition was filed with the Texas legislature to include Mark Smith on the master roll, and it was testified to by William T. Austin, FMPs, and F.W. Jackson. However, he was denied recognition. The original omission of these men is hard to explain. But Dick the Drummer can now be removed from his shadowy recognition. Frank Tolbert, in his book, The Day of San Jacinto, referred to Dick as the big Negro slave who beat Reveille on April 21st. In 1850, the Austin newspaper printed an article which was in turn reprinted in the Houston Gazette. It said, "In speaking of San Jacinto dinner, we inadvertently omitted a notice of Dick, the venerable drummer of the Battle of San Jacinto, the gray-haired descendant of Ham. Honor to our patriotic old man. His name will be handed down to posterity." We can establish with certainty from written correspondence and land records that Dick was not large in size, but in fact a man of modest build. His real name was Richard Robinson. He came to Texas in 1835. He was not a slave, but was a free man of light color, called a mulatto. Robinson did not end his career on the battlefield of San Jacinto, but joined the Milam Guard in 1842 to willingly participate in an invasion or defense against Mexico if required. He also served with considerable distinction in the Mexican-American War in the Battle of Monterrey and Buena Vista. So this remarkable man, along with his other men in the musical corps, on April 21st, they, being fellow drummer George Brown and 4 fifers, Luke Breed, Luke Bust, Frederick Lemsky, John McBee, and Martin Flores, led a vengeful band of Texans straight into the jaws of battle and a final victory. Not, as many have suggested, to the music of Thomas Moore's love song, Will Ye Come to the Bower, but to the inspiration of Texas' own version of Yankee Doodle. An interesting compliment to the battle cries of the soldiers who were yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," and the first time to have been heard on a battlefield, a high-pitched, fearful yell that came from their Celtic heritage, later to be known in the Civil War as the rebel yell. So, if we look across the battlefield of San Jacinto, there are many heroic individuals to mention, but are there some non-people that we should give recognition to? And I would suggest so. And who would they be? Well, San Jacinto, worthy of recognition, the non-human combats worthy of recognition, would first be Houston's horse, Saracen, and the mount Santa Anna escaped on, Old Whip. Now, the high point of necessity in the history of horses was clearly the settlement of the West. In 1836, the horse was the preferred and frequently only means of transportation in North America. Unlike their replacement, the automobile, they were frequently loved and respected by their owners. For his part, Saracen must have been an exceptional animal. Houston got him for the price of $400 from Isa Palmer, who was a sergeant at arms at Washington on the Brazos. Now, excuse me. At the beginning of the San Jacinto campaign, when some accounts describe him as white, he was most certainly a dapple gray. This was the color given in statements after the battle by William Zuber, James M. Hill, and S.F. Sparks in their accounts of the battle. In addition, James Gillespie verified this information at the trial of John Forbes in 1859, who was being tried for having killed a woman and stolen items off of the dead Mexican soldiers. When those of the Mexicans capable of returning the Texans' fire were looking for a ready target, a big man sitting atop a large gray horse in the middle of the battle must have been an attractive target. There is no telling the number of rounds Saracen took before giving up his rider, although it has been suggested the number was 5. Saracen's death must not have passed as a casual event for Sam Houston. He had just lost a loyal and magnificent mount that had carried him in retreat and then into battle and into the halls of eternal fame. On his back, Houston enjoyed the most glamorous moment in his entire career. One can only hope that Houston returned to the battlefield to pay his respects to that noble companion. When Santa Anna mounted Old Whip to flee the Texans, he had a horse that could easily have taken him to the promised land of the Mexican army on the Brazos River. No horse was faster or better suited for the ride than Whip. Whip was owned by William Vince, who built the bridge across, guess what? Vince's bayou. Santa Anna took notice of the magnificent black stallion of Vince's homestead, and immediately made him a member of the Mexican Light Cavalry. He rode him to New Washington and Morgan's Point and continued to San Jacinto with Whip leading the way. Santa Anna had obviously taken a liking to the big black stallion. When he emerged from the tent to observe the attacking Mexican army and his fleeing Mexican cohorts on the afternoon of April 21st, Whip was standing nearby. Santa Anna had arrived the afternoon before, and the fact that Whip was outside of his tent is evidence that Santa Anna had chosen him as his preferred mount. Certainly Santa Anna would never have envisioned that Whip was carrying him to safety rather than victory, because Santa Anna throughout his career always led the light cavalry charge. Anyway, on April 21st, mounted on the best horse he had ridden in Texas, Santa Anna was, for the first time in his life, leading the retreat and not the charge. Whip knew the road, and he was headed for the barn. But thanks to Deaf Smith's burning of Vince's bridge, he was not so rewarded. Old Whip became mired in the mud on the banks of the bayou in an attempt to cross Vince's bayou. Santa Anna quickly dismounted, slapped Whip on the rump, and bid him adieu. That was the seminal event in the Battle of San Jacinto. Failure to cross Vince's bayou on Old Whip and rallying his army for a counterattack would have been the results had Santa Anna reached the Brazos River. But his capture by the Texas Army the next day sealed the victorious destiny of the Battle of San Jacinto. So what can we say in conclusion about this event that we all as Texans share such a wonderful common heritage? And I can say to all of you that quickly that this event was defined by the newspapers of the time as one of the seminal wars in all world history. It has been called by various historians as one of the 16 most decisive battles in all world history. And how so? Well, it's not because of the size of the armies on the field that day, it's because of the consequences that it produced. Texas became a republic that fostered the annexation of Texas to the United States and the subsequent Mexican-American War, in which the United States Army acquired 334 million acres of land, stretching the United States from sea to shining sea. It was the last piece of the puzzle in manifest destiny. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1847. 2 years later, gold was discovered in California. And the United States went on a path of prosperity never before envisioned by the founders of this country. And whereas the men on that battlefield and the armies that they commanded were small, the results of that battle changed not just the history of the United States in Texas. The results of that battle changed the world. Thank you. What time is it?
It's perfect timing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just quickly, let me show you some. This won't take but a minute or two, assuming this thing will work.
Hold on, I got to put it back up.
This is our diorama of the battlefield. If you all, whoops. Hope this will encourage your attendance at our museum. Okay. That's a protractor that was used to define the boundary between Texas, Mexico after the Texas Revolution, and also the boundary between the United States and Mexico after the Mexican-American War. That's a map, obviously, of what Texas would look like, or that part before its annexation to the United States. Just other symbols of that. And of course, all this is what Texas, what was acquired, all the various states that you see to the west. These are pictures we have in the museum. That's the earliest known picture of Stephen F. Austin done when he was in the Arkansas Territory, and at probably 23 years of age. That's a picture of Sam Houston done in New Orleans in 1835. Interesting thing, you can see his on his lapel there's the general's star. Now, this was in October. He wasn't even close to being a general in October of 1835, but I guess he was already foreseeing his future in the Texas Army. There's Santa Anna with his numerous medals. Santa Anna had about as many medals as anybody could ever get, but some of them were legitimately earned, but it's interesting to know that he gave a lot of them to himself. There's just another rendition of that picture. This is interesting. Let me go back to that if I can. That's Santa Anna's smoking hat that he was in when he was in his tent at San Jacinto, and maybe having pleasure with the Yellow Rose, he might have had that hat on. That decanter was also found at the battlefield at San Jacinto. This is just some quick shots of what the diorama looks like. There's Sam Houston out front with on his dapple gray horse, Saracen, and there's the only flag carried by the Texas Army. Actually, it was provided by Sidney Sherman's brigade. This shows the Mexican Army in defense, and the Texas soldier. There's the twin sisters. That's Sherman right there. There's Burnett, Houston again, Mexican Army defending themselves. You can see the carnage there in Peggy's Gulch right behind the battleground. So there we go. Come to the museum and thank you.
You've seen less than 1% of the Bryan Museum just now. There's quite a lot there to see.